Our presentation today is To Speak or Not to Speak About Trauma, Shifting the Focus to the Present Impact of Current Events and Assimilation on Children. We have a few housekeeping items that we'd like to talk about before we get started here. First off, if you need help troubleshooting during the presentation, please use the chat box on the right-hand side of your screen, or you can email us at info@brycs.org. The webinar will be recorded and archived, and a follow-up email will be sent to all registrants within the next few days. That includes this recording, the archive of the PDF of the slides, as well as a survey where we will garner your feedback. We will have a Q&A session at the end of today's presentation, so please hold your questions till the end, and you'll use the chat box again on the right to submit those questions. If we, for whatever reason, don't get to your question, we'll post that question on BRYCS blog and respond to it there. Finally, at the close of today's presentation, you'll be redirected to a short evaluation, and please do take the time to fill that out. We use all of your feedback as we develop future webinars. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce our speaker for today. We have Goli Amin Bellinger. Goli is a clinician and consultant in private practice where she provides therapy to couples in crisis. She also conducts psychological assessments and provides forensic testimony to individuals seeking immigration relief through asylum, hardship waivers, and petitions for victims of domestic violence and other crimes. For the past 5 years, she has been an adjunct instructor with the University of Maryland, Baltimore School of Social Work, where she teaches a course of her design titled Clinical Social Work with Immigrants and Refugees. Ms. Amin Bellinger holds a postgraduate certificate in global trauma and recovery from the Harvard Program in Refugee Trauma. She brings over 15 years of social work experience in both clinical and administrative settings in the fields of mental health, child welfare, and immigration. She has served in the federal government at the Office of Refugee Resettlement as a monitor and technical assistance provider with both state refugee coordinators and shelters for unaccompanied children. At the U.S. Committee for Refugees and Immigrants, she co-authored an adaptation of the evidence-based model and established relationship enhancement for refugees and immigrants. This work has been replicated several times through federal funding to support couples and parents as they adjust to life in the U.S. She has also served as a consultant to several ethnic and community-based organizations, serving refugees both here in the U.S. and Venezuela. Goli, I'll turn it over to you now. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, everyone, for attending and calling in. Jackie, thank you for the invitation, USCCB and BRYCS for the opportunity to do this webinar and share with you my story. The objectives for today is to help you really collect the different elements of a child's trauma story for the purposes of healing. To do it in a way that avoids creating a toxic trauma story as defined by Dr. Richard Malika of the Harvard Program Refugee Trauma. The idea is to help both sides of the listener-storyteller relationship learn and understand about the trauma. So the premise really is that Dr. Malika's model is that everybody at some point in time will be exposed to trauma. It's not something that any of us unfortunately can escape, whether it's death of a loved one, divorce, significant illness with yourself or within the family, or terrible accidents. Unfortunately, none of us are immune, but we can all learn from our storytellers, from our survivors. Also, for children, I think it's really important to try to incorporate into this trauma story not just the past of what happened, but the present stressors of assimilation and what's happening within the news of acts of mass violence, terrorism, politics, what children are experiencing and how that may affect them as related to the past story or independent of previous trauma. And then, of course, I will focus on show common signs of trauma impacting mood and behaviors. As one of the premises of this is that while everybody will experience trauma at some point in their life, experiencing trauma does not mean anyone is necessarily traumatized. That's a longer-term process, which I will share later on in the session. And interventions and recommendations for working with children and their parents are woven throughout this presentation. So the background kind of how this webinar was done is really building on the blog with the same title. The blog, this new invention of how to communicate online personally with your own story. They tell me it's not a new invention, but it's totally new for me. So I've kind of taken this story that I shared within this blog of what happened when I was a child, and try to really disassemble the toxic trauma story, both within the blog and now to kind of complete and show a much larger story and help you, by hearing that story, help you be able to collect more elements than just what's typically shared, and it's kind of toxic. So here's what the story that typically got shared. So my early childhood memories, people would ask me, "Oh, you experienced war. What do you remember? Do you remember?" Well, in Farsi we have something called bombarun. When there's bombing, it's a rain of bombs. That's what it's called, the literal translation. And so here are my memories. Sitting by candlelight, because my parents would say, because our apartment is small, we don't want them to see us. Waking up in the back of the car, noticing that my aunt's pulled over to the side of the road. How come we're stopped? So they don't see us to drop the bombs on us. Oh, okay. Standing and waiting quietly in the basement. Why quietly? So they don't hear us. And then, which really, the one thing that bothered me, I think, that stood significantly in my mind always was this running to stand under doorways and stairways. Why? So the ceiling doesn't fall. Well, not having a sense of engineering and understanding as a little kid, to me that doorway and that stairwell was ceilings. But this is what they told me, and this is my story. Of war, if you ask me, what do I remember? This is what I remember. So what happened? This is what Dr. Malika calls the toxic trauma story. Highly emotional, no resolution. And what does that do to you as the listener, as my audience? Kind of overwhelmed, not sure. Unfortunately, this is not a discussion format part of the webinar, but I would normally ask you, what's your response? But usually when there's a sharing of a toxic trauma story, people are typically, the listener is in some way overwhelmed, repulsed, kind of disgusted, not sure, uneasy. And all of this definitely leads to empathic failure. I mean, how are you going to empathize anyway with the little kid of, oh, I knew how it was to stand under, you know, it's hard to do any of that. So the purpose of this presentation is really to avoid that, because otherwise, like, why would I share and why would you ask? Which brings us back to the title, to speak or not to speak about past traumas. Why would we put ourselves through this? So we know why, right? As a mental health professional, we know that I know that it's important to talk about past traumas, but there's a time and place. And here's the recommended way of doing it. This is Dr. Malika's Elements of a Trauma Story. There's 4 elements. My focus will be on explaining what these elements look like within children. So the 4 elements. 1, there's facts, the history, what happened. The second is the cultural meaning, the social, historical meaning of what happened to people. How do people understand what happened in their home country? The third is what he calls looking behind the curtain, kind of like on a stage, behind what behind the curtain, what's happening with the actors. This is revelations, deep down revelations, thoughts that people have over time, or about what happened, what's their new understanding of life, of the world, of people's capacity to hurt others. What is it? And the final element is the listener-storyteller relationship is such a key element here, because the idea is that healing happens through relationships. I work with couples. My focus is I can help people heal, but it's within the context of their relationship with somebody else. So as you can do that within a therapeutic setting, or within any listener that's hearing from the storyteller, the healing can occur if you can gather the story element, these elements, as well as the listener becomes kind of the student and the storyteller becomes the teacher, to teach you, share with you some ideas about trauma that you may have never experienced and hopefully never will. But to prepare you in the future, if and when it is your time to experience a traumatic event. So with children, and with the focus of this presentation, I'm going to talk about not just assessing what happens then, but also assessing what's happening now in the life of a child, what's happening in school, what's happening in school, what's happening in the community, what's happening at home, what's happening on the news, what's happening now, not just what happened then. So if we use this framework with my story, with what I just kind of shared with you, often people ask, those were just the few elements I could share. This is what happened. I never shared what I shared with you in the blog. That was a more complete trauma story. So here, what was missing? There was always just this narrow focus of war. Not anything else. The country was going through a revolution at that time. What may have been happening with my parents, how life was then there, what was happening in the U.S. after I had come, looking differently, being different, experiencing bullying, and back then, there wasn't the word bullying. There was the word bully. It was not bullying, so it wasn't talked about as much as it's nicely done now. And then also missing in my idea were later conflicts. Listening from my story were later conflicts in the Middle East when I was in 1992, when I was in elementary school, and there was a new war with Iraq. I remember just learning, you guys are mad at Iraq, but when I was, my country didn't have a good relationship. We didn't like Iraq either. That was like my initial response. But all of this was kind of missing, the cultural meaning. The Persians have a saying, whose hands is the world in? Dunyadas tekihat. It's just, over time, it's a country with a long history of not only being an empire itself, but having lots of different empires come into and take over its territory. There's just this kind of keen sense of understanding life and politics in the world. It's just, this is kind of something that, I don't know, happens. I'm not going to comment further on that, but further cultural meaning, what did it mean to me that when September 11th happened, it was to me connected to where I was from, and then the aftermath and continued wars with Iraq and the Middle East, and up to even last summer threatening future war in my country of origin. So this story my trauma story continued to follow me, and it really also, what wasn't discussed was how it took a long time for it to become part of my awareness that this was really building my bicultural identity and what it meant to me to be from these two different worlds and that combined rather than these two separate worlds. Also missing from looking behind the curtain, when the bombings were happening, the opportunity to go over and have sleepovers with my family. This was a nice time. I wasn't alone. There was something about group unity, cohesion, survival. There's something about people being together that helped endure the trauma of kind of what was happening with bombs. And also what to me is just fascinating is that the way the society there responded, they had a radio show for kids. So, this is how you kind of distract children in times of warfare. I still remember this, the broadcaster saying, now children, and going on. I remember they told stories to us to have us kind of distracted while our parents could manage whatever, or distracted from our parents' fear, I hope, I don't know. And the other thing is that the remaining family endures. People are asking me in the United States or looking at me as if somehow I am traumatized from the past, but people, unless fortunately, I never actually experienced destruction to my home or where I was. There wasn't immediate destruction right around me. So there were, or my family, so there weren't these lasting impacts. Remaining family endured. The people of Iran endured. They do over time, as all kind of cultures and societies do over time. And the listener-storyteller relationship. So again, the result with all of these elements missing from the trauma story, not only was there kind of empathic failure on the part of the listener, but on my part, I had this sense of responsibility. I felt like I really needed to assure them, don't worry, I'm fine. We're fine, no problem. Everything's fine, But then at the same time, like I had this feeling that I was strange or exotic or different somehow, and knew that by just by having to share that story without its other elements. And it led to, of course, each time self-doubt, guilt, shame, confusion. These things happen to your speakers without those other elements incorporated. So I want to avoid that. So the rest of the presentation is what to fill in. I've shared with you what was missing, but this is kind of what to fill in, what to look for, what to talk to kids about. I'll share with you questions to ask. So with a child's trauma story, these are some important things to go along with gathering facts. 1, what was the age of the child? How long were they exposed to violence? Were they directly exposed to violence, or did they hear about it? Were they witness? Did something happen in front of them to their family, in the community, or just something that through the news? What's the history, the facts around the past or current political instability in the country right now while they're in the United States? What's going on in their country of origin? Obviously, Syrian refugee children are seeing what's still happening on the news with people from their country. Still in war, still the refugee fleeing situation. Another significant part of the facts of a child's trauma story, whether there or here, is incidents of child abuse. Was there separation from family then? Is there separation from family now? Is there any family fragmentation? Was there divorce also that had happened within the family? What are the children dealing with? What's the family dealing with in the context of also of this war or other trauma story that you're exploring? Has there been school interruptions? There typically is. If there's bombing going on, schools are closed. Universities closed typically in the middle of revolutions. And then also impacting the facts of the story is a child's awareness of their parental distress, or is there marital distress, or is there mental illness in the family, both while they were there or while now they're in the United States adjusting. So here's some possible exploratory questions for you to ask about then. To gather the first element of facts, who was with you? Who did you feel safe with? Were you ever alone? Is there a memory that comes back to you over and over again? Do you remember problems at home, in your family? Do you remember people fighting in your family? What happened in school? What about with your neighbors? Now, to assess what's happening now, I want to think of 3 different areas: school, home, community. School, bullies, teachers, classes, English, having difficulty learning English. Some children never learned to read and write in their own language, so now they're learning English and reading and writing. What are the stressors? Are they being harassed? Where are they being harassed? Such as the bus on the way of going home. What's happening in the house with their parents? Do they have siblings that are struggling? What's happening to their sleep, the dreams, their nightmares? Do they have nightmares? What's the content of their nightmares? Is the content of the nightmares related to war? What's happening in the community, their neighbors? Are there gangs around? What are they seeing on television? What are they hearing in politics or right now even around our upcoming elections? What do they see on Facebook or social media? Terrorism. What do they hear about terrorism? What do they experience? So some possible exploratory questions to ask about the now. Do you ever feel in danger or unsafe? Have you ever talked with your parents about it? Often kids don't talk with their parents about it. This is something that's important to know. Have they shared with their parents? How have their parents responded? Do your classmates or other kids bother you in school or in your neighborhood? How have they hurt your feelings? Have you ever thought a teacher was mean, especially to you? Is there a part of you that makes you different, that you don't like? What have you seen on the news or the internet that has bothered you? Has anything on Facebook or social media scared you? Those are facts. For child trauma story elements, story and context, what's a child's knowledge of the historical context to even make meaning out of what's happening? When I was a 7-year-old, war was occurring, that was one thing. If I was 12 years old, my understanding of war would have been different. If I was 16 years old, my understanding of war and revolution, much different. And then, so what's the understanding then, and then what's the understanding now? And what's kind of my cognitive level of functioning then or now of which will affect my understanding. The age and developmental stage that the child is now, or how old the child was, stage the child was in at that time, and the level of protection available by the caregivers, by their parents. Some possible exploratory questions. What did you understand of why there was revolution or war or that terroristic event? What did you learn later? What have you found out since leaving and coming here to the United States? Since as kids get older, they learn more. They understand more. Is there anything you hear with the elections that bothers you? Tell me what happened to you when you first learned about the current event, what may be happening now, terrorism overseas, domestic terrorism here. Maybe they see mass migration of refugees on television in Europe. What happened to you? What did you think? What did you feel? Do you remember? What are you thinking, feeling now? With me. The third element to look for children, with children in of their trauma story, with the looking behind the curtain, and the revelations children have, the understanding of the world and how things are. You can gather that by asking a child about their wishes and their hopes. It can help you understand the development even of their cognitive skills. It actually helps increase development. Children who have experienced trauma and endured it and survived and moved on people usually have, children and adults have a much deeper sense of and capacity for empathy. What's their understanding of their parental distress at the time? Is there intergenerational transference of trauma from before, or maybe from conflicts from before? And the most important, the child's feelings of safety and control. Where is that? How is that? Here are some possible questions for you to ask. What helped you when you were scared? Now, no, we're asking these questions in a way, too, that can help healing. What helps you now when you're scared? You're helping the child identify so they can access these things when they can access their coping skills, recognize they have coping skills and access them, to help you see what it is so you can help them access them when they need to. If you could have 3 wishes, what would they be? Ask this question about their country. If you could have 3 wishes, what would they be here? For your life in the United States, or for this country, for the United States? How has your thinking about it changed over time about what happened in the past? Does anything you experienced in your past help you better deal with problems you hear, or understanding when bad things happen on the news elsewhere in America or the world? How do you put things together because of what you went through? Also, there's kind of their sense of awareness around the parents. How has coming to America changed your parents, if at all? Kids can be kids can observe a lot. They might not necessarily understand, but children observe, experience, and can feel a lot of different things. You can tease them out here and get their behind the curtain stories and revelations. And lastly, the elements. Keep in mind when you're listening to this story, your client is the teacher. They're a child, but they're still teaching you about their life, about their story, so you can then turn and help them. There should be mutual learning on both sides when you're hearing a story of story from mass incidents of mass trauma. Within your listener storyteller relationship, you can help with them building their coping skills, affect regulation, help them better understand kind of their cultural identity formation. One of the best thing we can do when we're listening is also try to empathize to the degree we can. You must have been really scared, or this must have been very difficult for you, or you've really been through a lot. Wow, you've learned so much. Empathy validation. Also, when you're listening to this story and the way you ask questions, what's healing about some of these questions, the way you're asking to fill in the other elements, is it can really have, by filling in the gaps in the story, really have a more of a healing effect than leaving a story with all of these gaps, which ends up, again, becoming that toxic trauma story. So this is how it stops being a toxic trauma story. You're kind of disassembling and filling and building a new story. And lastly, part of the listener storyteller relationship with children, I think is very important, is for you to, if you can get some opportunities to facilitate parental support, either the child sharing the story with their parent and encouraging them, asking the parents of the children have shared stories, or, having a session with the parents and helping the child share whatever may need to be shared. So, possible exploratory questions within the listener listener storyteller relationship. Have you ever told your parents about XXX that happened in your home country? Have you ever told your parents about XXX that happened in the United States? I shared in my blog. I never shared with my parents what happened in teasing in school and harassment and bullying and teachers, and it's just never shared. I for whatever reason. So in your relationship with kids, you can encourage them to talk to their parents and get support from their parents. Another question, how do you see yourself as a fill-in-the-blank, Mexican-American, Guatemalan-American, Iranian-American, Syrian-American? How has your religion helped you? This is more about the helping with the identity formation, and you helping them access their coping skills, their own traditional historical forms of healing and internal support. So those are the questions. What's important to do, as I said, is empathize back, reflecting what feelings, concerns, and desires you may hear from them say. And most importantly, the Harvard Program Refugee Trauma really emphasizes, Dr. Malik emphasizes that thank them. Thank your storyteller for sharing, and you can share the story with you, trusting to share the story with you, and within that, share with them that kind of empower them that they were the storyteller, that you did learn something. Thank you. You really helped me better understand X, whatever you can point out. The power of, a mother's support for her child. Anything, pull something and thank, and it's important that you go through that process yourself of recognizing in this relationship that what you're learning from your client is helping you. Okay, so those were the elements. This next part is about recognizing stress reactions in children and youth. So, again, just because there was trauma does not mean an individual or a child or an adult is traumatized because of past trauma. While you're hearing these stories, you can look for it when you're gathering the different questions around completing the different elements of a trauma story. Through your observation and through your questioning, these are some of the things to look for to see if there has been a significant impact, if the child is actively in a traumatized state. So this is common things to look for when there has been a traumatic stress response. So a child re-experiencing the disaster during play, dreams, or flashbacks. They may be repeatedly acting out the disaster with toys or when they play with other kids. Children playing with guns and destroying things and bombing. You can see that in their play. It can be, when you ask them about their nightmares, it'll be in their nightmares or in the contents, different ways it gets incorporated into dreams. Child just looks really distressed when you remind them of, or when they are reminded of something. When they're talking with you, they look just distressed. They may be feeling right then as if the disaster is happening again to them. There's avoidance of the reminders of the disasters. They may avoid activities that remind them. There may be impaired memory. They just have no memory of kind of what happened. I can tell you I absolutely have no memory of being scared in Iran, minus when they told me to stand underneath those doorwells. I just don't remember ever being scared. And that's good. I'm happy I don't have that. So there may be withdrawal. A child may be in withdrawal state, difficulty feeling positive emotions. So just something to recognize. You want to have a number of these things that I'm going to show you on the next slide. It's not just one thing. One thing is normal, like my one thing of it blank out. This memory of being scared, that's a good coping skill. Arousal symptoms, increased arousal symptoms. Again, it's sleep, difficulty falling or staying asleep, irritability, difficulty concentrating. Child may get startled easily. Maybe there was a door shuts, or maybe there's a siren outside from a police car or fire engine. There's just an easily startled response that can be triggered. This is what depressive symptoms may look like in children. There may be just general emotional numbness, and not really, their affect is a little bit blunted or maybe flat. Or a child may just cry a lot, easily cries. There may be changes in the child's appetite. Child seems to get tired a lot, maybe falling asleep in class. Of course, that could be due to insomnia. Or this child can just really be afraid of sleeping alone. They have to go into their parents' bed or their siblings' rooms. They just may really look just sad too often. Or there's lots of interest in previously preferred activities. For fears and anxiety, there may be fears of being left behind or separated from the family. The child does not like being separated to go to preschool. The child does not do well on going to kindergarten or starting school. They really may struggle. And there may be some clingy behaviors of their parents or their caretaker or the teacher, never leaving the side of the teacher when they may be on the playground playing. There's fears that something will happen to a family member, fears of the dark, fears of being alone. Fears, and this happens with smaller children definitely, that they cause some part of the disaster. You know, because I had this thought, this bad thing happened to my family. Because I had this thought, or I had this feeling, or I got mad. That's why my daddy died and went away. Behavioral symptoms, regressive behaviors such as baby talk, thumb sucking, hyperactive pursuit behaviors, whining, irritability, angry outbursts, participating in high-risk behaviors, sexual activity, drugs, alcohol, participating in gangs, stop participating in favorite activities. And then with that, somatic symptoms that you can ask about. Child having headaches, often complains of headaches, stomach aches, nausea, dizziness maybe. There's a loss of bladder control, not just while they're sleeping at night. Maybe there is in bedwetting, or in addition to bedwetting, they lose bladder control on the playground or in the classroom or when they're with their friends or family. Somatic symptoms you can ask about right in front of you. So when somebody is telling you, sharing with you elements of a trauma story, you can ask them, how are you feeling right now with me telling me the story? What do you feel in your body? Is there anywhere in your body that's like tingling or feeling tense or weird? Ask them about their stomach, their tummy, or their back or shoulders, or look at their hands. Some of the stuff you can see on people. If they're having a headache while they're talking to you, they may keep grabbing their head. Maybe there's dry mouth and they keep drinking water. But these are all, while you're asking these stories, you could be triggering a stress response, which is okay as long as you go through it with them and recognize and go slowly, empathize and validate. And go to more of those stories of revelation and child's insight, accessing their coping skills. As for interventions, this presentation isn't necessarily about specific interventions to be used by mental health professionals. There's a lot of training out there about that and working with refugees, and I have them listed in my resources at the end. But common interventions for mental health professionals for children who are, more in this category of traumatized, or there's a development of a mental illness, or there's a lot of struggling at school or outbursts of school or at home, there's obvious depression and a traumatic stress response. So cognitive behavioral therapy has been shown to work well with refugee immigrant children who've experienced trauma. Short-term therapies, narrative therapies. This sharing of the trauma story, Dr. Malika's 4 elements, this is a form of narrative therapy, actually. And therapy can include psychoeducation as well as helping children recognize, understand, and manage stress and grief reactions, helping them explore the story, fill in the story, like I shared with you today, these other parts of the story, not just the most toxic elements, and really building and replacing some of those negative memories and building alternative narratives. Of course, all of this it depends on the age of the child. Things that paraprofessionals can do, you don't have to be mental health, licensed mental health professional, but a trained individual. Teach children about stress and stress management, teach them about grief and common grief reactions, about being aware of the self and their body, what's happening in their body, when they're tense, when they're scared, when they're sad, where do they feel it? And with that awareness, you could teach people relaxation techniques, how to breathe, guided imagery, to picture beautiful things or relaxing things. I can have group sessions with children to help them build coping skills, do social skills training, a variety of things that can be done outside of the professional therapist's office. And finally, the last set of recommendations, I put these together to really help maximize mutual benefits from your interactions with children. So not only does the child benefit and isn't left with a toxic trauma story, but you aren't either, and both of you kind of come away with some new insights into the world and trauma and the child within themselves or the adult with their history from their childhood. So, on mutual benefits. Start with strengths. We wouldn't be a social worker if I didn't say start with strengths. Things to think about, to know, or to have with you, of course, strengths is all children have adapted to a new life and new language. They came here, they're in this new country. Just by virtue of time, there's been some level of adaptation. Maybe it's not at the level that you want it to be, but they have adapted, and that is in itself is a strength. They've learned a new language. Maybe they're not very fluent. Maybe they make a lot of mistakes. Maybe they're afraid to talk sometimes, but they did learn a new language, a second language. Maybe it's a third language. Their parents, they chose to begin their life over again. While nobody really chooses to escape and flight from their country, every immigrant chooses to come to enter the United States, to leave their country of refuge or leave their country of origin and actually come to the United States and begin their life over again. And then also assessing kind of the community resiliency and protective factors that there may be within the ethnic community that's living here, or what they have that's helped the child be resilient, the protectors here. Back to my example. For the protective factors and the survival, I think of my family and the Iranian people that actually survived any bombings and weren't affected directly. The sense of community was like, with being with my family, sleepovers were absolutely my favorite. We waited together in those safe places in the basement. I was together, I wasn't alone. Everybody was together. It's very different than when people come here. People come here and they're alone. They lose their family. Maybe they come alone. They're not with their parents. It's very different than the experience here. So there are protective factors from those past traumas that may not be here now. But I shared with you what the government then did on having stories for children to distract children so they can listen on the radio when this nation was in this state, such a vulnerable state of warfare. Another thing, my other memory is that my aunt would give us these vanilla wafers to eat. Me and my cousin was little. I easily got distracted with food and radio. There were these things that helped me not be scared, and that's why I can tell you I have no scared memories. Okay. So recognize adaptability and coping skills. Honor the decision to not talk about the past. Forget that the past. Don't forget that the past can be a valuable coping skill, and that generally people are adaptable. Only a small percentage of the population gets and remains traumatized. People are adaptable. And while I can tell you I don't have scared memories from those bombs at the age of 6 and 7, I do have other bad memories of losing my family, being separated from my family, or struggling in school. This is a simple screening for mental well-being with children. You can ask the child, when you're learning about the story, do you have nightmares or any difficulty sleeping? Often anxiety and depression and traumatic stress impacts pretty much always sleep, nightmares, as well as eating. So you can ask about that. If they say, yes, I do have nightmares, ask about the contents of the nightmares, and then you can, from there, ask about memories of the past. If no, they're okay, then focus on the present. Focus on the present stressors. Or they might not want to talk about the past, and they just want to talk about present stressors that are leading to nightmares from the past. These are a few interventions with parents in addition to everything else. We want to ask about changes in a child's behavior pre and post arrival. Assess the parent functioning. If you have an opportunity, are they working? Have they been able to get a job? Are they learning English? What's their comfort level with speaking English? How are they functioning? This may be a little different within a Hispanic population. People don't need to necessarily always learn English, so that's not necessarily a weakness. But you want to measure around language, the level people are struggling or maybe really scared. Assess parent levels of distress. You can often tell on a person's face if they are actively in distress and what's happening at home or what's happening at work in the community. They can be having their own difficulties with memories from the past or new incidents of world terrorism around the world or domestic terrorism could be triggering things. And one of the things that happens between parents and child is really encourage children and parents to talk together more about what's happening now and as well as the past as necessary. Parents just get so focused on survival and taking care of the family and adjusting to life in the U.S. and getting new jobs and learning a language. They kind of there might be kind of a separation with talking with their children. It's not on their minds, and they see the child's okay. Survival is the most important thing. And the child may not be bothering their parent knowing that. It's probably one of the reasons I imagine I never went to my parents. I don't know why, but tell parents to monitor. We're now telling parents to monitor and ask about social media. not just about bullying and harassment, but also traumatic news stories, alarming political commentary, discriminatory or offensive posts that children are getting exposed to that may be really upsetting for them and need to help process. And last couple things. I really have enjoyed this from the Harvard Program Refugee Trauma, 3 recommendations to facilitate healing. Anyone can give these 3 recommendations out. I do it in multiple settings when I'm providing counseling or when I'm not. 3 things that help heal: altruism, work, spirituality. This is for adults. For children, altruism would be encourage a child, maybe an older child, not an older child, but one that's been here for a while, to mentor a new immigrant. Encourage them to tutor someone else. Get them involved in a leadership activity. For a child, it's about going to work. The element of work for adult, work for a child is school attendance. Participate in activities, sports. These 3 recommendations are all about being active and distracted, I think. And, of course, spirituality. Finally, I can't emphasize enough to all of to the entire audience today, self-care is incredibly important if you're going to help others heal. Try to take your lunch breaks every day. If you can't do it 4 out of 5 days, take that lunch break, revive, recharge. Take your breaks during the day. If you had a really difficult client, take a break afterwards. Take a break maybe in the evening when you go home from your regular daily activities. Don't cook dinner that night if you had a really hard case during the day. Talk with peers. Again, healing happens in a relationship. Talk with your coworkers. Talk with your supervisors. Supervisors, set up regular peer exchange in your office to discuss cases related to help staff process cases related to trauma and healing. Really the goals really is to breathe, rest, relax, learn from one another and clients and support. Literature and resources. Of course, BRYCS has a world of resources. And the first one, National Traumatic Stress Network, is a great website too, from the Harvard Program in Refugee Trauma. Okay, that's it for the presentation. I'll turn it back to you, Jackie, for questions.
Thanks, Goli. So we'll open it up to everyone here. If you have any questions, please use the chat box on the right. Sorry, there is a mistake on the slide. So yes, the chat box on the right. And again, if we do not get to your question, we will respond to it on BRYCS blog.
Aha. You want more time on the resources slide? Sure. And you can also download a PDF on these slides, and you will, so that's there for you to have. Yes, of course, these same methods would help with adults. Thank you, Christine, for your question. So Dr. Malika's elements of a trauma story, those 4 elements were designed with adults. I've adapted it for use with children. But yes, absolutely. I use the same way to gather information when I'm working with a survivor of torture or an asylum seeker. And as well as not just gathering this information. So when I'm gathering information from an adult, while they may have traumatic incidents that happen in adulthood, I ask in the same sensitive way about traumatic incidents to help explore traumatic incidents that happen in their childhood. So there's a question of when you work with populations who don't have access to mental health but have been victims of trauma, how do you help them to heal with trauma? So this trauma story, the listener-speaker relationship, these 4 elements that I talked about today, that is designed for anybody to use and to ask. My blog and elements of that I've shared here were based on people, friends, coworkers, teachers, professors asked me about war. And so but with those few details, it just left a toxic trauma story. I've shared this with you, so anyone at any level, when you're asking somebody to kind of go through these elements and have this general attitude that you're learning from your client, I'm sharing this with you, and the Harvard Program Refugee Trauma has established these 4 elements of gathering the story, and for everyone to do it in the same way, kind of put everybody on the equal footing, the mental health professional as well as the friend, the coworker, the refugee service provider, the teacher. How to advocate with schools to get them to assess them rather than attribute things to trauma. Perhaps sharing some of these slides with your on the difference between someone exposed with trauma and that not necessarily meaning traumatization, and the signs to look for when somebody is traumatized, I think would be the focus to help separate that. But yes, thank you for that comment of what to do in the school setting. I know that's difficult. I am sharing this information. Kathy Elkins, you're asking if I'm sharing this information with teachers in schools. Yes, this webinar was designed for agencies that serve refugees, agencies that serve unaccompanied children, and school personnel, teachers, school counselors. When you're asking a child about a trauma story, or when you're talking about traumatic incidents, different elements to go into and discuss, and not to forget, so you don't leave somebody in a state of a toxic trauma story. It may be helpful to share with people what's and identify this phrase, a toxic trauma story, and distinguish that for people from a healing trauma story, one that has these other 4 elements. It also, I think people like it because you can talk more, and it doesn't leave the speaker in a very uncomfortable place. It doesn't leave the listener in an uncomfortable place, and it doesn't leave the speaker in such an uncomfortable place. It's just more comfortable for both sides to be able to talk in this way, rather than the one that just leaves both sides with a toxic story, something that we see typically on the news, these flashes of toxic stories that are overwhelming and we want to escape and avoid.
Thanks, Goli. We do have a question here on if somebody does have additional questions after today's presentation, what's the best way to reach us. And you can email us at info@brycs.org. And if it is something that requires Goli's expertise, we will certainly put you in touch and forward your inquiries to her.
Okay, I think we have another. Yes, I see a couple more questions coming in. Maybe I can answer one more question. Thank you for your questions, and thank you for calling in today. I do look forward to additional questions. You can either post it on the blog or send them to info@BRYCS.org.
Okay, and with that, I'll close up today's session. Again, our contact information is up on the slide. You have our general website, our email, and our toll-free number. And as I close today's presentation, again, you'll be redirected to a short survey, and we appreciate your feedback. Thank you, everybody, for joining us.